I'm Kim Rubin from the Tax Policy Center. I will be your moderator today. I am super excited to hear from the three authors and the discussants about their papers. To start, I was going to explain why these things are related to each other, which I think there is a theme that runs through this, which has to do with the fact that what is it that government does, and this sort of goes on into the plenary next time, is what do governments do and how do they do it? And so I think the theme of the papers in my mind today are governments provide services for the people who live there, and ideally what governments are trying to do is not only provide services but grow their communities or economy. And so partly, how do they do that? How do they fund the things that they're investing in? How do they try to encourage development within their places to give the people who live there and the community in our country a better outcome more broadly? And so what we're going to do today is we're going to look at some aspects of this. We're going to start with the conversation about how do communities, especially local governments, think about how to fund what they need to do and invest in. Then we're going to talk about TIFs or tax increment financing and whether this is a good or a bad measure that states can use or local governments can use to try and encourage businesses to come, to ensure that their people have jobs and they have the growth going forward. And then finally, we're going to talk about something that we hear a lot about, but we don't necessarily have good data on. We hear a lot about how everybody is behind infrastructure, but what does that mean? And why is it so hard for us to invest in infrastructure when we all think that this is the way forward and it's going to be this boon for where governments and the country should go? And so I think it's an exciting program. Hopefully we will keep everything on time, so we'll have some time at the end for questions and also some discussion between the authors and discussants so we can actually look at these things more broadly. And again, I also think it's a really good segue into what's coming next, and so it'll help sort of set the stage for that. So to start, Ramona D'Agostino is going to talk about the impact of bank financing on municipalities, bond issuances, and the real economy. Thank you. And Ramona is at the University of Rochester at the Simon Business School. Thank you.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me say thank you very much for having me. And this paper comes very much within sort of a broad agenda on working at the intersection of banking and local governments. And I am very much looking forward to feedback or to comments, institutional details, particularly from the people on the banking sector, practitioners, people out there who are not just in academia. All right, so let me start. So this talk will be very much related to what I guess Professor Ken yesterday was discussing, that is, what is the marginal value of one extra unit of investment? And, you know, you might find the question, the fundamental question in the paper very academic. Do government purchases stimulate the economy? And as people out there in the field and practitioner investors might think that the answer is obvious, actually, we've been debating in academia for the past 40 years, even longer, on whether actually government purchases stimulate the economy. So this is a long-standing question, and what I'm going to argue in this paper is that the municipal bond market, it's very much a useful lab, a useful laboratory to discuss the fiscal multiplier debate. And the way that I'm going to do it is by using a pretty unique institutional feature of this market, which is the bank qualification, which many of you will be very familiar with in this audience, and I probably will have to spend less time than when I present this paper in academia, where I have to discuss what is this bank qualification. Well, as you might know, I'm able to pin down exactly who the investor type is. So it's a bank lender for the most part. And so discuss how who finances spending is just as much as important as how the spending is financed, which is what pretty much we have been stressing overall in the literature, that is whether it's financed through tax, deficit or transfers. And so what I'm going to show just as a preview of results is that Actually, the value of a marginal $1 of privately placed debt is not identical to $1 of publicly placed debt. And what I'm going to show is, and I think it would be the most, I would say the most interesting result in the paper for people in the field, practitioners, would be that actually local governments are not indifferent between $1 of financing from a bank and $1 of financing in the public. So retail investors think, or funds or insurance. So banks seems to be special for local governments. And here I very much welcome feedback from bankers to discuss this further, because this really opens an agenda in my research string of papers. So what I'm going to show is that local governments seem to bunch, so they seem to want to restrict their issuance, so to be able to place their debt with a bank rather than losing the bank access. And I'm going to show what is the value of actually relaxing this constraint to bank financing and allow local governments to get more funding from banks. And this is very much, as many of you might be familiar, very policy relevant, because the SEC has introduced a new rule last August on disclosing bank financing, which, as researcher, we're very frustrated because local governments wouldn't release data on detailed loans or whatever else is going on besides bonds on their balance sheet. So as researcher, we very much welcome this SEC rule, not so sure about local governments welcoming it. All right, so let's jump straight into the paper. So as you know, the muni market is 92% of it is tax exempt, but there is this peculiar discontinuity which is special to banks. That is that if a local government issues up to 10 millions within the calendar year, then all of this issuance becomes labeled qualified for bank holdings. And so the banks get the complete free lunch on it, the complete tax exemption. But if we go over, as a local government, the 10 million, the entirety of it, so the average one, not just the marginal part, loses the qualification. And so if the bank holds even just $1 of exposure to this non-qualified issuance, the bank will face a different schedule of taxation, a much steeper taxation. All right. So, and the taxation comes very much in the interest expense part of the banks, and we can discuss this into detail. I just got 15 minutes after all. All right, so not surprising, the bank qualification matters for banks, and as you will see, if you look at core reports, banks concentrate their holdings on the qualified part of the municipal market, that is where they get the vast majority of their tax exemption. And so it's pretty much 10 times bigger than their non-qualified exposure. And here I'm showing it as a percentage of total assets. And also banks pretty much make the entirety of the qualified segment. So they're pretty much the one investor in the qualified municipal market. And it's the solid line. The outstanding and the dashed line is what the banks hold of it. All right, so the natural question is, do local governments care about the fact that at 10 million, they're going to lose the bank access? And as you can see, just at 10 million, we see this big discontinuity, this huge jump, which we would call bunching in the literature. That is, local governments apparently don't seem to be indifferent because they seem to cluster right at or below the 10 million threshold, and there's a missing mass right on the right of the 10 million limit. And the interesting thing here is that very much everybody here gets the tax exemption. It's not that this is a tax exempt market and this is a taxable market. Everybody here gets the tax exemption. It's just that here it's got to be banks. And here it's got to be funds, insurance, and other types of investors. All right, so we do have this excess mass at 10 million. And the question is, then how can we go from this visual evidence that it seems that local governments do care to sort of an estimate of intensive and extensive margin response of local governments to this discontinuity, presence and absence of local governments? Well, the first thing that one wants to investigate is, is there a rationale for this jump that we see at 10 million? And, the obvious thing that one would look at is cost of financing. And so if you look at yields, here I'm really plotting spreads over synthetic treasuries. There is a little bit of a jump at 10 million. So it seems like placing with a bank, it's cheaper. You can do a back of the envelope calculation, and you can see that just issuing $1 extra will imply that that single extra dollar will cost you over 200K, between 200 300K more, which squares very well with then the bunching estimate, which would be the behavioral response of local governments. If we try to sort of draw a counterfactual and say, what if at 10 million that wasn't discontinuity and banks were allowed to enter the entire market, how much would a local government actually borrow more from a bank? So how much are they restraining themselves? And you can use these bunching techniques to sort of draw this counterfactual. And actually, it shows that the average reduction in bond issuance is about 3.4%, which kind of squares well with the fact that the cost of financing, the extra cost of finances will be in the 200, 300K extra for one extra unit of dollar raised. And that's a particularly large mass of governments that are affected, which is about 29% of local governments in the bunching range. So local governments seem to care and seem to not want to lose the bank access. This might be due to cheaper financing. However, I'm not taking the stand that this is the only reason for which local governments choose to prefer bank financing. Some robustness. And so the second part of the paper really tries to figure out, okay, so local governments seem to be restraining their financing, so to get access to banks, and because they could potentially tap the insurance, they could potentially tap other types of investor, but they don't. So what if we let them get that extra unit of dollar? Would that be a positive implication for, infrastructure, public safety, all the investment in the economy, and pretty much I'm going to look at employment and total wages. And the way that I'm going to do it, I will just very briefly go through the identification, is by trying to pen some sort of counterfactual of unaffected municipalities that are not affected by this bank discontinuity, but they still fund themselves through banks. So we're comparing same type of municipality financed in similar ways. And I'm going to use them as a counterfactual to see, this is how my bunching individual would have behaved had the bunching not been there. And I'm going to use also a change in the regulation, which happened in the Obama package, which moved the discontinuity from 10 million to 30 million. Okay, so I have 2 minutes, so let me jump into the results. And you can see that actually once local governments are allowed to shift the limit of the bank financing from 10 million to 30 million, they very much use it. So the red line are the municipalities who were bunching, and so they were up against the constraint. And as soon as this limit of 10 million moves from 10 to 30 million, they increase their borrowing. And the blue lines are the municipalities who were still bank financed, but they were not up against the 10 million constraint. So they were issuing 1 million, 2 million. And when the constraints moved from 10 to 30, so from a non-binding to further non-binding, nothing almost changes to them. And so the over and above is very much the effect, if you want, of this change. And the bank limit, and the limit of the bank financing. And how does this change translate into employment generation? It translates into a positive employment generation, which is that one standard deviation increase in intensity of treatment, intensity of relaxing this constraint within a country increases next slide, increases employment by about 14.7 jobs for each 1 million extra dollar of bank financing. And this effect in employment, these 14 jobs generated or saved, pretty much come from private sector, not from government employment, and pretty much in the urban areas rather than in smaller non-urban areas. And as regards the total wage bill, every extra $1 of bank financed spending generates $0.8 increase in the total wage bill. So let me conclude. There's a bunch of robustness tests in the paper that keeps on growing at this stage, but let me conclude with a brief discussion on the results. So one particular thing that is important in this paper is that really I'm able to pin down a source of internal financing, so a source of deficit finance that will be paid back in future taxes, which is very important because the current literature wasn't able to sort of focus on deficit financing. A lot of it was coming from transfers, federal transfer, which we really don't understand if it's actually the way that we think about government spending, when the government can spend and not pay back what it spends. And on the so this is sort of an estimate that captures what we really want to measure. It captures a very peculiar investor that we might be very interested in, which is bank financing, which goes to the question, is a dollar, we would say in Latin, pecunia not olet, but it actually might smell, money might smell different whether it comes from banks or not banks. And as a matter of fact, if we compare it to a really great paper by Adelino Ferreira y Cunha, who show another form of deficit finance spending but doesn't come from banks, the results are different. That is, they find a much bigger impact in the local economy, while I find a much smaller impact than Adelino. So, does it speak to reallocation of capital, the role of banks in the economy, crowding out? This is very much an open agenda for me, so if there's bankers in the audience, I would very much like you to reach out. Thank you very much.
Ivanov from the Fed is going to come discuss the paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, my name is right there. Okay. Thank you very much. So this is a great paper. I've seen this paper in the past. First, these views are my own. They're not the views of the Fed or the Federal Reserve System. Okay, so now for the paper. So I've seen this paper in the past. I think the paper has changed quite a bit, has improved. It's a really good paper. And so I'm not going to spend much time on this because the author did a very good job here, but just very briefly. So basically the paper studies how his continuities in the Internal Revenue Code affects municipal bond issuance. And after that, the author is looking at how such issuance is going to affect the real economy, right? And so she looks specifically at wages and employment. So the cool part about this paper is there was this change in the rules in 2009 that moved this limit from $10 million to $30 million just for two years. And this is what the author exploits to get at how much muni bond issuance affects the real economy. Okay, so in terms of the findings, they're pretty economically large effects. So she finds that one additional million of spending leads to approximately 14 jobs on the average muni entity. And these effects are substantially larger for the urban areas. Okay, so let me talk about a few things that maybe I would like to see in the paper in the next draft. So basically, the Internal Revenue Code is not black and white like that, right? I think there's a lot of additional things that I think we need to worry about here. So it's not as straightforward as like, okay, if you're under 10 million in issuance, you get this exemption. If you're not, then you don't. I think there's a lot of carve-outs in the codes in the code about advanced refundings, private activity bonds, industrial development bonds, which I think these entities issue a lot of, right? So they don't really count. I mean, from how I read the code, they don't really count towards this limit. And I think it's very important to talk about this when you're talking about financial constraints, right? Because that's how you frame like the study. So they don't issue, they choose to issue less to take this exemption. So I think I would really talk about this in the paper actually. And I've put the part of the code that I basically read there, so you can take a look at that. So this is like key to the paper because we need to make sure that they're not able to issue through any other source. Not that it's a big issue in terms of the final result, the real effects. I think it's more of an issue of how we interpret results, right? So I think my read of the results, like in light of this, would be that the costs, so I lower the cost of issuance, then the entity issues more, and then this is the final outcome. So I think this is like maybe how it could be like framed. So I don't think it's a big issue, but still I think it's important to talk about. Okay, so this is an area I've really worked on. So loans, muni bank loans, and as the author says, I mean there weren't that many of them in the early 2000s, but they've grown over time. And so in the later part of the sample, so I did this through the call reports. This graph is not going to fully match your graph because you got it through another source. But it looks close. So basically what you see here is by the later part of the sample, muni bank loans represent approximately, almost as large of a part as muni bonds. So I would really like worry about this as another source that entities could fund themselves. And why do I worry about this, right? I mean, you can say even if these are not, even if these don't count towards the tax exemption, right? Even if they don't get the tax exemption, as you like said earlier in your slides, I mean there is not much of a disclosure requirement for those. So I think the banks could offer a lower cost to the entities because they could literally be at the front of the line to everybody else, right? And so this is the issue that I would worry about here, right? Okay, so and we do find in our paper that muni bank loans like offer substantial cost savings. So in terms of the empirical setting, so I think this is something that I would talk about in the paper. I don't know whether you can do much about it, but I think I would definitely be open about like saying, look, I mean, we don't see this, but this is not an issue because of these reasons. One thing that I think you could do is you could use the census survey data to see whether this represents an issue for your study. So from there you can get the overall amount of debt and you can see like whether like the bonds issued are going to be less than that, right? Like does the entity have like other sources of funding there? Okay, so in terms of the multipliers, I think I would worry about like basically how like different these two groups are. Like, so basically you define this treated group as the one that's really close to the 10 million limit, and the control group is the one that's like under it, like the small entities. Now, I looked at your results there, though, and I thought that they appear substantially, these two groups appear substantially different on key dimensions, such as revenue per capita and tax per capita. I mean, they don't appear statistically significant, but these gaps are very large, so I think I would definitely worry about it. And I was looking at the smaller group, like the control group. It seems like the standard error is super large. So I think I would probably try to remove extreme values or something like this to see if you would find any statistical difference there after that. Okay, so I would also, another thing I would do here, I would probably try to change how you define the two groups. So I would play with cutoffs. Okay, so let me just, I think I'll skip the prior literature, because we can talk about this later, but I want to talk about this part very briefly. So our bank special here, I think this is very very nice. I think I would want you to include more on this. And I think in order for you to say banks are special, maybe you can just see if banks are able to offer some of the contractual features they offer to the firms that they work with. So basically, I would just compare bonds that are held by banks and bonds that are not held by banks, and then I'm going to look at, okay, is the issuer going to renegotiate these bonds more if they're held by banks or not? And then I would look at a certain key areas of the financial contract. Thank you.
Do you want to respond, or do you want to do it at the?
However you guys want.
So I was going to maybe hold questions to the end so we can have a broader conversation, but if you want to say a couple of things, if there's anything specific you think you'd want to respond to right away, we can.
No, I mean, no, thank you very much. These are great.
Gotta use the mic.
Oh.
Okay.
All right, we'll do that later then. Are we broadcasting? Is that why we're using the mic?
So people can hear.
Okay, so the next paper is going to be about tax increment financing and economic development, and it's Kamla Dibidi. Did I just totally screw that up? From the New York SUNY Binghamton. We're going to do all the papers and then do Q&A afterward.
Okay, sure.
Hi, everybody. My co-author is Rahul Pathak, and we feel very honored to have this opportunity to present our findings before you. We have a pleasant mix of academics and practitioners, so we look forward to your insights on the paper. This morning, I'll be talking about the link between tax increment financing and economic development outcomes. The background is quite straightforward. There's been widespread use of tax increment financing. It's set within the background that tax and financial incentives are important to reduce the costs that businesses face when doing business. And by reducing such costs, it encourages investment, especially from the private sector. And the links between investment and economic development is already well established in the economic literature. So the rationale for tax increment financing is to bolster economic development within communities. It's been touted as a self-financing strategy. It's been touted as a strategy that's market-based. It's been touted as a strategy that promotes economic development in actuality. So we will be exploring these potential linkages But first, let's get a little background on how tax increment financing works. It starts with a municipality designating an area for development and then using potential future growth in tax revenue, that expectation of growth in tax revenue as collateral to finance the current cost of capital, to finance investments in the area. The way this works is that in that tax increment finance designated area, property values are set as base property values. So it's like those base property values are frozen. And so revenue from growth in property values above the base values are called the tax increments. And that is directed solely at tax increment finance spending and investments. There's another connection in all of this, that within the tax increment financing jurisdiction, it is likely that other local governments, like school districts, for example, will have tax boundaries that overlap within the district or the jurisdiction of TIF. Such local governments also have their base property values frozen during the time that tax increment finance is in place. At the expiration of the TIF projects and investments, all local governments can now benefit from the growth in property values, the potential growth in employment, and all the benefits in economic development that might accrue within the larger area. So that's typically the rationale. That's typically the mechanism and expectation for promoting economic development. This chart is quite a straightforward way to appreciate how the base property values are frozen until the expiration and how the benefits will accrue to all local governments involved. The focus of this work is on the state of New York. And it's because there have been major changes in TIF law within the state. But quite surprisingly, or to some unsurprisingly, only 2 municipalities have used TIF since the enabling law in 1984. So we've been curious, especially as New York State residents, and we wanted to do a prospective analysis of TIF in New York. Our focus is on Broome County, and with a prospective analysis, it's very future focused. So this is not based on actual happenings, but to a large extent, actual happenings have informed the probabilistic analysis in this work. So we'll be exploring potential impacts on TIF on economic development outcomes over time. And by economic development outcomes, which I'll be saying recurringly through the presentation, we are mainly talking about 2 things: tax revenue growth related to increases in property values over time. And that's one dimension of economic development. And another is the more direct growth in employment or job creation over time. So the research question is straightforward too. What is the likely impact of TIF on economic development outcomes beyond what would have occurred without TIF? So the literature on TIF emphasizes that in order to count or measure the actual impact of TIF, it's important to analyze it in the context of what would have occurred without TIF. So that's the very well-known but-for dimension. There's been abundant work in this area. In fact, some of the people represented in this room have published even books on on TIF. But the findings are quite conflicting. The links between TIF and economic development, some studies have shown positive impacts, others find negative impacts. Yet many of the studies show that the results are mixed and inconclusive. The analyses have been at various levels, so it's not like there is a scarcity of analytical approach. It's been very exhaustively studied, but the results are mixed. What we are doing is to shift the dimension of analysis to a prospective frame. And the hypotheses are that one, TIF or TIF is associated with a significant growth in municipal tax revenue over time, and that it's associated with significant increase in employment over time, but for the TIF. The data uses a mix of actual and simulated data in line with our prospective analysis. So we use census data. We also use information from previous studies, estimates, and parameters. To proceed, let me just halt my pace just a little bit to give you a little background on Broome County. So this is the general layout of Broome County, New York. One of the things that economic development experts within the county tout is the proximity of the county to major metropolitan areas within the region. And they tout that as a way to attract potential investors. This is basic data on the county, comparing the county with trends in across the state and across the U.S. So now to proceed with the method of analysis, we use a Monte Carlo simulation method. And this is a probability-based scenario analysis. It starts with determining the model. And the deterministic model of outcomes now is helped with inputs. And these inputs are brought into the model based on their probability distributions. So there's actual data on the inputs, and each input will have a probability distribution. And these distributions are used to simulate the model with all the parameters in the model and to make many iterations and to predict potential future outcomes. So that's the analytical approach we use in this work. The thing with Monte Carlo simulations and the outputs from there is that the outputs are in the form of probability distributions. So they talk about likelihoods, likely impacts, potential impacts. And I'll be using those words and phrases very often for the remaining of the presentation. So to speak to the first, to speak to the research question about municipal tax revenue effects, we use this deterministic model of impacts on revenue growth over time. And these are real revenues. And when I say over time, I'm looking at typically a 25 to 30 year period, which is the typical time period for bond investments related to TIF. In this model, there are some key parameters that I would like you to focus on. One is the fraction of assessed value of the municipality that are within the TIF district. Essentially, if the fraction is larger, then the potential impacts and will be larger as well for revenue. Another is the growth rate of properties in a TIF district if the TIF district is operational. Another one is the probability that properties in a TIF district would have been developed without TIF. So if there is a higher likelihood, then that will limit the impact of TIF within the models. So that's the basic underlying model for the simulations and outcome scenarios. Again, this is probabilistic, it's prospective, so they are likely and potential outcomes. So how does the impact on tax revenue over time look like? Based on the simulations and all the input parameters, we found that the mean growth in revenue over time is about 9.5%. And there is a 95% probability that the mean growth will lie between 7.5% and 12.1%. So these are pretty decent growths, especially when you think about this in terms of real revenue growth. We can also determine which input parameters have the larger impacts on our outcome scenarios. And you remember you promised that you take a look at the parameters I highlighted. So Q is one of them, which is the likelihood that the district would have developed anyway without TIF. And then the fraction of properties that are included in the TIF district. So if benefits are to accrue in terms of revenues, the larger fraction will be more beneficial to revenue. So what we can do is to do a sensitivity test on each of these major input parameters and see how revenue will respond. And that's exactly what we did. So for that fraction figure, assuming a median value, which will cause a 50%, which will cause 50%, 1 minute, okay, which will cause 50% of the properties within the TIF district to accrue revenues, which is very generous. We find that the highest level for revenues will be about 10.9%. And we do some more shocks and see the effects, like the change in that probability, the Q, the change in growth rate of TIF properties and neighborhoods. And generally, the outcome hovers around 8%. To the second question about growth, and now that my time is off, I'll just squeeze the rest in 30 seconds. So for the outcomes in growth, the results show that there's very limited effect. There's no significant effect on employment growth over time. And we are looking at a 95% probability that it would lie between negative 0.1% and positive 1.7%. And the mean is 0.57% growth over time. Again, we do these sensitivity tests. We show how the outcome responds. But I'll end with this summary and policy issues for discussion. Thank you very much for your rapt attention.
And Steve Friedman is going to discuss it. Real life history.
Thank you. Oh, we're cut off here. Is there a, she's going to fix it? Okay. All right. I'm a practitioner, so I'm going to bring some of that to this. The findings are consistent with other research on it's predicting positive impacts on property value, marginal unemployment, and this is consistent in a lot of ways with the body of other studies that have been done. And it's also important to note that there's a lot of concern with transfer effects, just moving development around within a municipality and so on. So why is this occurring? And I'd say that a key reason is that TIF is actually a blight remediation tool, not an economic development tool. 34 of the 49 states have blight as a condition for establishing TIF. The second key, and they're not synonymous with economic development. The second thing is that TIF isn't that powerful. So it's not, TIF intersects with real estate economics on the margin. It can cover up to 20%, depending on which fractions of the you cover. You include up to 20% of real estate costs, but real estate costs are only 2 to 10% of the costs of operating a business, of an enterprise. They are a bigger piece of residential, but they are not a big piece. So it's not powerful enough to overcome global forces that are affecting economic competitiveness in municipalities. It is powerful enough to fill a gap, to cut a deal, to make a deal happen. So in practice, we're focusing on capturing real estate, desirable and desired real estate projects with infrastructure spending support or gap financing. It's a tactical tool also used in the competitive world of municipalities to capture tax base from another municipality. That's just reality. It's used heavily to capture, to pay for infrastructure, and it's used for all land uses, not just in industrial. And in the industrial sphere, employment may not be the best measure of progress because with automation, employment is decreasing. Manufacturing output is now the measure that we use when we try to do market analysis for industrial. We're using manufacturing output, not employment. So TIF is a co-investment tool, and it taps and enhances private real estate markets. So what are the best practices for TIF? We would argue that there are 6 necessary conditions for using TIF. One is the project contributes to important public goals. Never forget that. This is for public policy. This is not just a giveaway to private business. It's not just filling the gap for every blasted real estate project in your community. Second, the project needs to be economically feasible with assistance. We really don't want the thing to die after we throw a bunch of money in it. The project would not proceed but for the assistance, and it should pay for itself usually with the revenues generated by the project. Only occasionally are the economic benefits broad enough to justify broader use of increment from outside the project. And then it should be undertaken, and this is sad and difficult because a lot of nice developers or would-be developers will come to a community, they want to do a deal, it's a bootstrap technique, but they don't have any money, they don't have any capacity, they don't have any experience, they don't have any financial partners. And having financial partners is critical to being able to do the last thing, which is shift the risk to the private sector. Common uses, financing, public improvements, funding extraordinary costs of development, but the more controversial ones, doing above market and non-market deals because you want to change the image of your community. We've done those. A nice fancy Westin hotel in a lower income community that changed their image. Higher quality development, attracting or retaining investment in strategic, and then it can be used programmatically. So if you have, and this is one of the great uses of the inflationary gain, if you have inflationary gain, you can do it to create a program like we have in Chicago. We have TIF-NIF programs, neighborhood investment. The inflationary gain is pledged to support a loan from a bank to fund grants to homeowners and small businesses. So how do you evaluate the need? There's a little stoplight map to show you, to think about whether it really needs help or not. Risk-adjusted rate of return, a reasonable risk-adjusted return, extraordinary cost, true public improvements, and sometimes the incremental cost of locating in a competitive environment. So the but-for approach to gap and competitive analysis is critical to guarding against over-subsidizing the projects, and to do that, you have to do hard work. You have to analyze the deal. My friend Charlie Long, who used to be a city manager, and as most of you know, city managers lose their jobs very regularly, as he did, and so he became a developer. Do the hard work, deal by deal, competently. And it is hard work because you have to take apart the project to get to the proper level of assistance, which is that which is required by financial feasibility or the need to compete. It is not the percent of a project arbitrarily. It is not the eligible project costs. It's not the capacity. So you do a detailed analysis to understand the gap, and that involves, in the case of a real estate project, it involves taking apart the pro forma, every part of it. The development costs, the market factors that are leading to the revenue, the expense costs that are involved in order to arrive at a reasonable rate of return, and research on what reasonable rates of return are, because that is not a readily publicly available number. And this, by the way, costs the municipality money. Sometimes they can get it from the developer. The costs of this are anywhere from $15,000 to $250,000. We did this analysis for the Dan Gilbert's project in downtown Detroit, toward the high end of that. We did this for the Lincoln Yards project in Chicago and for the 78 project in Chicago, toward the high end. We've done 36 reviews in the last 3 years in Kansas City, toward the lower end. There's individual one-off deals. But it's not cheap. It is not cheap, and municipalities that think it's cheap or free are making a big mistake. So now, then you move to trying to change the risk profile. There are many ways to monetize the TIF. Going from pay-as-you-go, which is just what's available, to developer notes of monetizing just the future revenues from the project itself through the developer, doing special revenue bonds and land-secured bonds, backing bonds with other revenue pledges. On that Westin Hotel in Wheeling, to get the TIF deal done, we pledged first the TIF from the hotel, but we also pledged sales tax from the municipality and other revenue from adjacent TIFs to strengthen the bonds. Which the bonds performed. The hotel went bankrupt, but the bonds performed. It's public sector real estate. Do a loan instead of a grant, and then there's also, in some cases, trigger and take out bonds, where when you have everything together, you might do a GO, but the last thing in the world you really want to do is a GO. And these charts try to explain that. And it's a timing problem. There's a mismatch that gap financing is most needed by the developer in the beginning, but the revenue is not available to year 3, and that is why you need a well-funded developer. And then the municipal risk spectrum is lower risk at the left side, where it's just out of the TIF revenues, highest risk when you use full faith and credit, which you really don't want to do if you can help it. The policy implications, we need to seek other tools for severe economic distress, new markets tax credits, philanthropy, other mechanisms, because TIF is not deep enough for that. We could authorize linked TIF. In Texas, in Dallas, they managed to do this by having a district that runs all along one of the transit lines from north to south. North is rich, south is poor. You're rolling money back and forth. We tried to do that in Chicago. We wanted to create a series of TIF districts and just roll the money one to the other all over the city, and the law department stopped us. But you could do a specific kind of linked TIF. We need to require more planning and goal setting that should precede designation and precede deals. I actually do this in Idaho. We're working in Boise. We actually do plans before we do TIFs. Amazing idea. Coordinate with other tools so we have layered financing, and then make sure we set the right underwriting and due diligence requirements through the but-for analysis, the developer capacity, and then try to mitigate the public finance risk. And then ultimately establish accountable decision-making. I believe that one of the reasons that that Jerry Brown had to kill TIF in California was that it had become detached from elected official decision-making. They had commissions that could make the final decision. It never went to an elected official. One of the reasons it survives in Illinois, as controversial as it is, and in Wisconsin and Minnesota, is that the decisions, every final decision, is made by the elected body of the municipality. Okay, thank you.
All right, and our final paper is infrastructure costs for Leah Brooks is from GW is going to present work that's joint with Zach Liska from Yale Law School.
I got my box. Thank you for having me. Thank you for giving me a box to stand on so I can see you all. This is a project joint with Jack Liskow at Yale Law, and we are interested in infrastructure spending or costs. And as you know, this is a topic that's been substantially in the news. There are proposals to spend lots and lots more money on infrastructure. And despite this, we really don't have a good sense about how much we get of infrastructure per dollar we spend. So in the US, we are currently spending about $400 billion per year on infrastructure. And as you've seen, there are proposals to spend a heck of a lot more. Of course, you can only get based on the costs. So the more infrastructure costs, if you spend a lot more, you're still not going to get much infrastructure. And there is a widespread perception that infrastructure is pretty expensive in the US. There's a widespread perception based on very little data. Okay, so why do we know so little, despite our widespread perception? First, data are limited in this sphere. And international comparisons are really difficult to interpret. Different regulatory schemes, different labor schemes, even domestic comparisons are difficult, comparing between one state and another state. And I don't think we even entirely agree on what actually infrastructure is. So, what we're asking in this project is, has per unit infrastructure spending increased in the United States? And we're going to argue that yes, it has increased about 3 times over the period we're looking at. And then we're going to ask where and why. So let me tell you, after giving you the answer, let me tell you what it is we actually do. So in this paper, what we do is we focus on interstate construction. So the construction of new interstate miles during the construction of the U.S. interstate highway system. And the goal here is to limit our analysis to a relatively homogeneous good. Now, you may have driven on the interstate, and you may think, I do not think that all interstate miles are homogeneous. And look, I agree with you. I, too, have driven on the interstate. But I want to say that I think we can all agree that a mile of I-95 and a mile of I-5 are a lot more similar than JFK and the Port of New York and a train yard over here. I mean, so I'm not telling you they're the same, but I'm telling you this is as close as we could get to something that was reasonably comparable over space and time. So what we're first going to show you is we're going to show you a large increase in spending per mile over time. But this is based on new evidence we collected, and we're going to date this increase roughly to the early 1970s onward. So that's big fact number 1. And then the second thing we're going to do in this paper is assess which pieces of evidence are consistent with this large spending growth. And one of the first things I'm going to show you in this section is that per unit costs of labor and materials are unlikely to have driven this increase in spending. I'm going to show you the picture. I think this one is pretty uncontroversial. I'm also going to show you that if we account for income, we can explain about half of that increase in spending over time. So increased income and whatever it comes with that people want when they have more income seems to account for about half of the spending increase. And then finally, I'm going to show you some evidence that above and beyond just wanting more things because you are richer, there is a set of institutions that change in the late 60s and early 70s, which we're going to call the rise of citizen voice. And those institutions give citizens tools to modify government behavior. And I think modify government behavior in ways that a lot of us think are good, right? We would like to not kill all endangered species, but that's expensive. And what we're showing you in this paper is some measure of how expensive that might be. All right, so let me give you the light speed relevant background on the interstate highway system. The funding starts in 1956 with the Federal Aid Highway Act. And this Federal Aid Highway Act sets in place a 41,000-mile system of highways, and virtually all funding on the system is limited to initially determined routes. And this is And the feds pay the majority. So states implement, they build and implement, but feds pay 90%. And there are similar-ish federal standards for construction in all states and time. So that's why you can think of this as a relatively homogeneous good. Construction is largely complete on the system in 93, and those are the bookends of our time period. So we're looking from 56 to 93 at the construction of new interstate miles. And critically, the system is fixed. So states are choosing how much to spend on a given mile. They're not deciding, oh, this interstate is too short and I would really like to build it 5 miles longer. No, they are deciding how much to spend when really they're not paying for much of the spending, okay? So how do states get money? The federal government authorizes spending in the amount of the gas tax revenue each year and apportions spending between each state based on the state's estimated cost to complete. And the federal government reimburses the state when the states spend the money. So the key part to take away from this is that if you would like to build really, really expensive highways in your state, you can just build them very slowly, okay? Because if you don't care about building them right away, you can get access to this money, that's this pot of money that keeps going and going. But if you want to build them fast, there's some incentive to build them more cheaply. So that's sort of the institutional setup. Let me give you the big fact. The spending per mile increase. This is using the raw data. So we're using data at the state year level here, and I'm showing you on average across the entire country, how much money we spend on interstates in that year, divided by the number of miles of interstates completed in that year. There are a lot of issues with this measure, which I'm not going to talk about. You can read the paper. All right, so this is a national measure. This is a 3-year moving average to kind of smooth out those kinks. This is the measure I'm going to rely on for the rest of the talk, which is the data in 6-year bins for those strange measurement issues I'm not going to get into. But basically, you see that spending per mile across the country is increasing over time, roughly tripled since the 1960s. And that spending increase is statistically significant, starting from instead of showing you, this is raw data, this is showing you regression coefficients now, looking at period fixed effects, if that means something to you. If it doesn't, don't worry about it. And what I'm showing you is that from 1970 onwards, that spending per mile is statistically different from zero. And I think a first obvious concern is that states wait to build complicated miles until later. So what this picture is showing you, the light green line that hopefully you can see in the background is the previous picture I showed you. The dark blue line is now controlling for the characteristics of miles built in the states in those years. So what you can see is that controlling pushes down the cost slightly, but not much, same temporal pattern. This picture is showing you by state the spending increase in state. So don't take the x-axis as an absolute number. These are relative figures. But you can see the light dot at the beginning of, mostly in cases in the beginning of the line, is the mean spending from 58 to 69. The dark dot is the mean spending in that state from 1970 to 93. In almost all cases, the dark dot comes after the light dot. In some cases, the gap between the dark dot and the light dot is really large. In only a few states does spending go down over time. And this is also conditional on those geographic covariates. All right, so given that big fact, now we're going to try to think what could possibly explain such a large spending increase. And I'm just going to divide these into hypotheses with little support in the data, some support in the data, and then hypotheses which we think are important, but for which we have either insufficient data or weak evidence. So before I do that, let me tell you how we measure the impact on change. Basically, what we're going to do is we're going to compare the first period, that's the pre-1970 period, with this second period in blue, the 1970-ish onward period. And what we're going to do is we're going to say in the first period, we're going to look at the average change, the average increase in that period above and beyond the beginning. And in the graph I'm showing you, that's an average spending increase of about $500,000. And we're going to compare that with the average change in the second period. And in this picture, that's $8.2 million. So the difference between 8.2 and 0.5 gives us our summary measure of change, 7.3, which you're going to see for the whole, it doesn't exactly add up, I agree, which is the summary measure I'm going to use in the rest of the talk. All right, so let me first tell you about hypotheses with limited support in the data. First, I've already told you that the spending increase is not driven by states waiting to construct geographically difficult miles. Second, it cannot be that states that these are driven by time invariant state features. So in the world of international comparisons, you may read that US costs are high because of issues of common law. And that may indeed be the case, but that's not what's driving our sample, because all the states in our sample were common law at the beginning, they're common law at the end. So features of the common law may be important, but they are not driving the spending increase we see. I'm also going to show you per unit input prices and changes in federal interstate standards, which I will just say here are unlikely to be driving the increase. There are very few changes in federal interstate standards over this period. Not to say that federal interstates haven't been built in a different way over the period, but that they haven't been mandated by the federal government to be built in a different way. So let me show you the input prices. This is that same old graph with interstate spending over time, but I've indexed everything to be 100 in 1961. Now I'm going to add, with the same indexing, materials prices. There's just nothing going on here, okay? And this are two measures of construction wages. First, an hourly wage, that's the solid purple line, and a measure of compensation, in case you think that the difference between compensation and wages could be driving things, and it's not. And I'm not going to even show you any statistical analysis on this, because I think this is a pretty convincing picture. If it just doesn't, there are no increases in labor or materials prices that are sufficient to account for this increase in spending over the period. Okay, so let me tell you things that do have some support in the data. First, I'm going to show you that demand for expensive highways increases in income. And if that's true, we should see the spending increase decline, conditional on income, and we should also see more stuff. You have to be building something different in the highway to account for this spending increase. And we know it's not a per unit labor price increase, so maybe they are putting, like, you probably haven't seen more asphalt in your highway, but you might see more noise barriers, animal crossings, pedestrian bridges, better water runoff, all these things that make a highway higher quality, at least to some people. And then we'll talk about citizen voice. So here's our baseline estimate of $7.3 million, additional spending of $7.3 million per mile, 1970 onward. This is what happens to that baseline estimate when we control for income. It shrinks by about a half. So controlling for the rise in income over the period accounts for about half of the increase in per mile spending on highways. Controlling for the value of housing, which is a little bit more complicated because it's a mix of income and land, also accounts for about half. And controlling for both income and housing values erases almost the entire spending increase over the period. So here is some evidence on stuff that you're building in the highway that could plausibly make it more expensive. We calculate a highly scientific measure of wiggliness, which is how wiggly your highway is relative to the straight line distance of the same segment of the highway. This is actually an engineering thing, but the engineering term is tortuosity, and I think wiggliness is just so much more comprehensible. So this is our measure of wiggliness, okay? And you can see wiggliness goes up over time. However, I want to totally be frank, there is not, if you look at the numbers on the y-axis, this is not like a doubling in wiggliness. Wiggliness does increase, but there's just not too much wiggliness in highway miles. So I think, my hypothesis is that there are things we are not capturing in our measures yet, stuff that people are building on highways. We also see increases in number of lanes and in bridges per mile, but none of these, when we account for them in our estimation framework, are really sufficient to drive down that summary measure of change. All right, so let me tell you briefly about citizen voice. So we define it as the rise of institutions that allow for greater citizen voice in government. And we date them to the late 60s and early 70s, and you can think of them as an amalgam of the environmental movement, the civil rights movement, and a growing homeowner organization. Plus changes in judicial doctrine and statute that give citizens more tools to challenge these key government decisions. So key dates here are the 1970 passage of the National Environmental Policy Act, the act that mandates environmental review for federal projects, that sets up the EPA, and a 1971 decision that really gives citizens the ability to challenge federal agency discretion via courts. So if this increase in citizen voice is important, we expect that income should be more strongly related to spending after 1970. And in fact, it is. If we allow income to have a separate effect in this later period, that relationship between income and spending is about twice the size in the later period as it is in the earlier period. And then finally, we also expect that elected officials should be more responsive to citizens in this post-70 period. So the way we look at this is to look in the congressional record at what politicians say on the floor of the House or the Senate. And this is us looking at the prevalence of the word environment near the word interstate in the congressional record, scaled by the number of times interstate appears. So this is the 1950s. Apparently we do not talk about the environment at all in relation to the interstate in the 1950s. This is us leading up to the passage of the National Environmental Protection Act, NEPA, in 1970. And you can see that there is an increased discussion, but you might think that after the passage of the act, it disappears, and in fact, that is not the case at all. What happens after the passage of the act is that this discussion is elevated and remains elevated. And then I have a set of hypotheses with inadequate or sufficient evidence, which I'm just going to basically tell you are measures of government quality. These may be important, but we may not be measuring them well. And the second set are measures of labor power. We just don't, from what we measure, we don't see measures of labor power driving this increase in spending. So in sum, we show that interstate spending per mile has risen sharply, beginning in roughly 1970. It's not explained by the per unit costs of labor and materials. And we think that the primary culprits are on the demand side, rising income, which makes people want better highways, and the power of citizen voice, which gives people more opportunities to challenge government decisions and act and require the government to spend more expensively. So we hope that this knowledge is going to help us weigh the benefits of infrastructure against its substantial costs. Thanks.
And Kent Rowie couldn't come. He had a last minute conflict. And Joe Kane from the Metropolitan Policy Program here at Brookings is filling in heroically. So thank you.
I'll try to pinch hit pretty quickly because I'm interested in the conversation, I think, following this. So that was a great presentation. I read the paper in the last few days, so apologies for my abbreviated sort of remarks, but I thought it resonated in the sense of, in particular, as you're describing, I empathize with you in the sense of just not a lot of data out there. And so I focus a lot on state and local infrastructure issues in particular. And so naturally the conversation seems to gravitate up to the federal, national level, but even there, it's hard to get consistent, comprehensive data. So I commend your efforts to even piece together this. And so, in that sense, I think adding value to even just the field for researchers and practitioners is helpful, right, to get a sense of what are we even talking about here in terms of the consistent, just what is infrastructure, right? And I'll get into some of my sort of, I think, limitations of that and sort of hopes for more in a second. But I think this idea of, right, spending per mile almost tripling, right, from the 1960s to 1980s, obviously a big building boom, right? The latter half of the 20th century, sort of the highway era. There's a reason that people call it that. And so I think we see that in your data. And then, of course, what I found interesting was the determinants, right, of that, which I feel you're right. There's a lot of I think, interest out there, particularly from the Congressional Budget Office data, which I think are often referred to here from 1956 all the way up to actually 2017, of input sort of costs and labor and material costs. And so it was interesting to see that not being as much a deterministic sort of factor here, but actually, as you're kind of calling it, sort of citizen voice, right? And I'd be curious to hear a little bit more of how you're exactly defining that, right, relative to some of these other data, right, I feel you're very consistent, right, and spending on interstate highways, right, over time in terms of specific mileage increases, but citizen voice, right, as being somewhat related to environmental permitting, but also civil rights. It just seems a little broad. Maybe I just didn't read the methodology close enough in the past 48 hours, but I'd be curious to hear some more of your thoughts on that, because I feel the conversation, at least federally at the moment, right, is permitting, right, and sort of, well, we need to cut all this red tape, right, and there was a famous picture of DJ Gribbin when he was sort of the special assistant to the president, went on stage with this huge sort of all the from point A to point B to point C, right, of all these different steps you have to go through. And that's just for federal projects, right? But I think, and it's obviously today, right, which is different than sort of 20 plus years ago, which is where your data kind of ends. But I think it'd be interesting to just hear more of your perspectives on that. Seeing the state level, I think, variation was was interesting. I noticed, and I'd be curious to hear more of your thoughts on, in particular, a lot of northeastern states popping there, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Connecticut. I'm not sure exactly what you uncovered in your analysis that seemed to really show those places spiking in particular, whether that's related to some of these demand side factors, right? I don't know, but I'd be interested to kind of hear more of your thoughts on that. And I just have to say, I love your term wiggliness. Never heard that before. I think it's, as much as we can be intuitive, right, I think about some of these infrastructure sort of data issues, the better, particularly for sort of non-infrastructure folks, right, so economic development folks who are thinking about this. And I think that idea of, I've done some work on sort of aging sort of highways, right, and we're kind of, and I'll get to this in a second, sort of this era of repair and replacement, right, and whether the wiggliness, right, of these highways has an effect on some of the costs that we're seeing today, right, not just in places like Boston, right, that everyone thinks about with the big dig, but places like Syracuse, Rochester, et cetera, that these highways are aging, right, reaching the end of their useful life. That's a big cost driver now, at least for the replacement. So I'm wondering if wiggliness has some effect there. So to sort of the points of like limitations and what I'd like to see more, which is, I'll try to be brief. So first is, right, what is infrastructure, right? I appreciate you being sort of federal, right, highways, interstate highway system, period, right? I think that's smart to limit it to that, but the fact is, interstate highways are only about 1.2% of total roadway mileage across the country. We have about 4 million miles of highway, or roadway, technically, and most of that, by far, is at the local level, locally owned. And so, in as much as I think this is part of the challenge in sort of the infrastructure debate right now, it's very big. It's sort of silver bullet solutions, national, federal, which isn't wrong, but federal needs to be a partner in the conversation. It can't just be everything, right? And so in as much as we're able to relate some of these issues, I think, to local concerns and state concerns, I think is hugely important. I won't go into too much detail, right, of the diversity of infrastructure needs, right, because I know that wasn't really covered here, right, but just geography, the difference in ownership, right, public and private. We're just looking at one segment of our transportation infrastructure. I do a lot on water infrastructure, right, which is 90+% spending is at a local level on that. But even in terms of transportation infrastructure, it's about 3/4, right, is state and local. So just in the sense of like, it's limiting what we can see here, right, just from sort of interstate highways, and just being sort of cognizant of that, of not trying to stretch the meaning of what we're seeing in the data to relate to some of these fundamental sort of state and local issues, who I think are, for the most part, in the driver's seat here, right? Like they are the ones who have had to really pick up the slack in recent years for a lot of spending, where the feds, right, have focused admittedly on capital spending, but in particular, and this kind of gets to my next point of sort of operation and maintenance, right, that we can't just think in terms of construction. I get that that's where the consistency was kind of in the data, but and I think it's partially reflected in, right, the 1950s to the sort of 1993, right? It's been 25 years since then, but even by that point, we saw sort of this shift nationally towards operation and maintenance in particular. So in mid-1950s, capital spending was about 60% of all federal spending. This includes transportation and water. Now it's only about 40%, where operation and maintenance is 60% today. It was only 40% in the 1950s. So there's been this sort of change in the calculus, I think, of spending overall, that it's just not building new stuff, right, but it's actually maintaining what we have. And then how we're thinking of that in some of these sort of funding and finance conversations. I would also point to, I don't know how you would capture this, but I have to mention it, right, is sort of the diversity of market changes and pressures, right, affecting some of these spending considerations. So VMT, right, the number of people driving has gone up over time, population has gone up, freight movement has gone up. We're seeing that not only recently, right, with e-commerce, but even going back to that. So there's just a lot of market changes, to say nothing of the climate pressures that we're seeing on our infrastructure. So I think that all feeds into not just sort of the need for new construction, but actually maintaining what we have and sort of the efficiencies, which I know is hard to do over that limited data, right, that you have. So really, I'd say, in total, it's a huge value add to see the consistency over time. I know I found value in it. I think just being cognizant of some of the limitations in terms of scale and coverage, not only in the types of infrastructure we're talking about, but also the time frame. I thought it was funny that 1993 was your end point, because that was the last time we raised the federal gas tax, which is obviously keeps coming up whenever you hear about, well, what should the federal government do? Well, the Highway Trust Fund is reaching insolvency. We should raise the gas tax. And I think people are kind of turning their heads a little bit now on sort of VMT fees and other sort of mechanisms here, but be curious, right, kind of where your analysis ended and kind of where we are today at sort of the 25 years since then. So that's all I had, but really appreciated the paper.
Thank you. All right, and so because we're going to do Q&A a little bit differently. I'm going to ask for, can I have the authors come up to the table? And can I have the discussants come sit in the front? Because I really want you to be part of this conversation, and just I'm very aware of the seating limitations. So if people in the audience have questions, or if you guys want to say something, please just let us know and we'll have you talk into the mic here. I'm also going to say, as people, can I? Okay, I'll go over there. I can go here. Well, good try. The other thing I was going to say is, first, if you can introduce yourself and wait for the mic as you're going to talk, that would be great. Before we start, do any of you have anything you want to say to your discussants in response? And then we're going to start a more general conversation.
I just want to say thank you. Thanks, Joe.
And I wanted to thank Steve for that elaborate discussion of TIF. I think the practitioner insights are excellent.
Yeah, well, I mean, as I said, thank you, Ivan, and we can definitely chat a little bit more about the details of it. So.
Okay, and now because I get to control the conversation, I'm going to start. First, partly reading these papers and hearing you talk, what sort of strikes me, and part of this is being a state and local person, I am so aware of the details and how things can vary, right? So in Ramona, in your paper, sort of thinking about how local governments might differ and what the difference is as you have this group. Like, I was very curious about whether part of this was certain people, it's very attractive to do the bank financing because they're smaller governments and they might not necessarily have as complicated financing needs. But like knowing more about what they're using this money to fund seems really important. Similarly, in the TIF conversation, it is not surprising to me that the results are all over the place, because I think that's fundamentally something that is driven by what the rules are in place. And so, and part of this is I spent a lot of time in California. And TIF in California, because property taxes are limited to 1% of assessed value, means that a large part of what the TIFs did is it meant that certain local governments who were on the boards got to control that money from other local governments, which is really different from a place where each local government gets to pick what their property tax rate is. And so when you're capturing some of the TIF money, it might play a different role. So I do think, and I like, Steve, your comments a lot about how this all worked together and how you have to actually know what the details are and sort of figure out what the programs are, because the localities and the individuality actually matter a lot. And then Leah, sort of picking up on some of the stuff that Joe was talking about, like I do think that there could be stuff very specific to certain places. Like it was interesting to see which places actually had less growth, North Carolina and Montana, over time. And so can you all talk a little bit about how much you think that the specifics of the local governments involved in what you're doing, or the governments involved, affected what your results are, and how broad you feel like your results are across other things?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it feeds a little bit into also the discussion that Ivan just gave. So what I can definitely say is that I do see the use of proceeds. The use of proceeds doesn't change, in the sense that if you look at qualified and non-qualified bonds, they seem to be, that money seems to go to the same purpose. And so it would be infrastructure, it would be hospital spending, it would be whatever you would think it's, but there doesn't seem to be a difference between the two. If we go back before the Tax Act, the majority of local governments was being actually financed by banks. So a lot of that spending was coming from bank financed money. And so in a way, this segment from 0 to 10 million is heavily reliant on banks, and the limitation also come in part from what a local government, from a choice of the local government to tap the banking sector for some reason, but also from a regulatory perspective, what they're allowed to do. So there are certain types of investments where they're just not allowed to tap the banking sector. For instance, things that are not public purpose, they cannot be financed through banks, and it's just the way the regulation is set up. So what is the difference in that sort of this goes back to Ivan's discussion, and do we want more of the banking sector financing certain types of projects? How do we think about them? These are questions that very much are on my mind, and they've been on my mind. And how do we think about the covenants? How do we think about the details of these bonds, the details of the renegotiations? Very much I would like to learn about it, and I think bankers are the ones who are in the best position to answer that question, because as a researcher, none of that information is available. Even like the Fed data doesn't have that level of detail. And
Do either of you
Kim, I think that's an insightful comment about variations, especially with TIF. The studies we looked at to develop our input parameters showed a wide variation in estimated coefficients. One during time periods, differences due to time period and differences due to level of analysis. So some of the estimates are the city level, some are the TIF district level, some are the parcel level, some are the census tract level or the neighborhood level. So all these variations come with differences in outcomes, estimated outcomes. Even within Broome County, there are about 22 local units. And the differences in tax rates is as wide as $21 per 1,000 and $1 per 1,000. So it's that wide. And all of these things bring that kind of noise into the analysis. So you see a wide variation of estimated impacts.
Just briefly, I think we're going to end up having a companion paper that looks at spending across states. We did some preliminary work, and I thought that when we looked at spending on healthcare spending and highway spending, I thought the high healthcare places were going to be the low highway places. But it didn't turn out to be such a clear-cut picture, unfortunately. Otherwise, I would have showed it to you.
Okay. Quick. Yeah.
I think the, hold it. Is it on?
Now?
Yeah, okay. So the variations, some of the things we didn't talk about necessarily, there's some other criticisms and controversies about TIF. Some of them have to do with the impact on school districts and on whether it is in fact reducing school expenditure. So I think one of the studies that I think David Merriman might cite in his recent paper has it as having a negative impact on school spending in Iowa or someplace. It doesn't have a negative impact on school spending in a place like Illinois or Wisconsin or Michigan, because they have different systems. And so the systems are so varied around the country that you can't really make blanket statements. Michigan and Wisconsin and California shifted education funding heavily to the state. Wisconsin sets a maximum on how much you can spend per student. It's very, very, really rather powerful. Illinois has a totally different. Illinois is the Wild West, by the way, in a lot of areas. There's another kind of program called Special Service Areas in Illinois and MUDs in Texas. You'd think in Texas that would be the Wild West. They're regulated by the state in Texas. They're not regulated at all in Illinois. So Illinois is just a crazy place. But Illinois has a property tax limitation law, PTEL, property tax extension limitation law, that basically negates most of the impact in the school districts because they get their levy. It sets a limit on the levy. The levy can only increase by inflation or 5%, whichever is less. So you have this wide variation that changes what the impacts are and changes what some of the questions are about the impacts of this tool and the use of this tool. And I thought that was something to get into the conversation. But there's this huge variation around the country and then locality by locality as well.
Great, thank you. Questions from?
I can actually add.
Oh, yes, of course.
Yeah, so for Ramona, I think there's certain things you can do, though. I think for the bonds, you can look at the assets that are underlying the bond, securing the bond. No, you can't.
There's no date on that.
I thought MSRB or
IFR
merchant.
doesn't have any of that
Okay.
data.
Alright.
Merchant,
Okay,
the
so
one that
okay,
I got
that's
doesn't have it.
so. I guess I guess that's
Back then, when I was back in Europe, I reached out to the MSRB. Getting the data from the MSRB
Right.
would have been impossible in Europe.
Yeah.
And
yeah. Okay.
I just
Well, I
don't
just
have
thought
the
it would be nice to have that, but
I
if you
agree.
can't, I mean, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to shut that off so that we actually have time for some audience questions. I just feel bad if I basically was the only one who got to ask a question. Okay, why don't we start with Paula and then Bill.
Paula Worthington from the Harris School at University of Chicago. So this is a question primarily directed at Leah. And the question is whether you had considered another aspect of interstate quality in terms of incidents of traffic fatalities. And if you were to control for vehicle miles traveled, and things like, and evolution of car safety over the time period you study, whether things had actually gotten better, so the quality improvement takes the form of being safer. And, I'm sort of struck by, when you showed sort of when NEPA was passed. I mean, there's also, that is a time period in which the public conversation and understanding about the value of reducing the incidence of fatalities was actually, there's a lot going on there. We had the Ford Pinto, we had, a lot of conversations there. So it isn't that, I wouldn't say that, saving a life in 1990 was more valuable than saving a life in 1960, but I would say that our understanding and appreciation of that had evolved considerably over that time period.
So that's a great point. I don't want to swear this because my co-author looked at the traffic fatality stuff, but I think we were unable to tie traffic fatalities to the specific section of the interstate that was constructed in a given year. So that's the data problem. Because yes, I agree. Like one way you could improve qualities of interstate would be to make them less deadly, and that would be a valuable improvement.
Bill?
Thanks. I'm Bill Glasgow. I have a comment and a question. So it's a comment on the bank lending paper, which was very, very interesting, and thank you. A couple years ago, I worked with a team from Stanford that presented a paper here on bank lending disclosure. There are 2 states where there actually is disclosure of municipal bank loans. One is California, which is the state we focused on, where the disclosure is not complete, but it's actually quite detailed. You might want to look at that. The second is Tennessee, which we discovered also has mandatory disclosure. It's paper-based. It's literally kept in a file cabinet in the State House. But there's a academic I ran into along the way who's been working on a paper for several years on this. But those are the only two states where you have it. Otherwise, your disclosure will be retrospective in CAFRs and OSs. And one question I have on the infrastructure paper, were the per mile numbers you use, are those nominal or real dollars? Because a lot of the spike in per mile costs came during the big spike in inflation that ended
Real.
with Volcker.
Real. Everything's real. So there are increases in real terms.
Okay.
George, well, go right, and then we'll go to the other side, and we'll end with like Tracy and the people in the last.
Yeah, I guess Ramona, she and I have had a couple of lengthy chats.
It's been very helpful.
I don't know what we do, given the data issues in particular, I don't know what we do about the post-tax reform period. But the fact is that bank holdings in 2018, according to the Fed, were down 75 billion, which is like over 15% of their holdings in 1 year. And it's going to, at some point, fundamentally change how the muni market works. We got lucky in the sense that with issuance so low, we didn't need the banks as much as we normally would. But it's going to become, answering the question, what has the role of the banks been away from bank qualified? What has the role been? And then what is it likely to be in the future, I think, is something that needs to be studied. For example, in terms of competitive versus negotiated, banks dominated purchase of competitive, and they're gone. They're literally gone away from the bank qualified, where there hasn't been any change in the size of that sector. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that. And then in terms of infrastructure generally, the fact remains, as I said yesterday, state and local governments aren't borrowing. It was unchanged last year to this year at a really lousy level, which suggests that state and local governments, while they have massive needs for infrastructure, aren't doing anything about it. So any thoughts on that?
This is a really important question. In this paper, my data ends in 2010, so it's 8 years before the tax change. And so I can't offer an answer as an academic. I can offer, because I don't have the data, I can offer sort of an opinion or, and definitely that is going to affect the cost of financing for local governments. And so it boils down to an elasticity question, to how much are you willing to move away from one type of financing to a different type of financing. How elastic or inelastic are governments going to be, and which type of government is going to be more or less elastic? It's an empirical question, and we need the time series in a way to be able, and that's a limitation, I guess, of academic research. We sort of have backward-looking given data.
Other questions? All right, we'll go here, and then Tracy, you'll be the last one.
Tim Bartik, Upjohn Institute. I wanted to comment and ask a question on Professor Brooks's paper, which first, the comment is, this is a great paper. I'm really glad you're looking at it. I'm glad you're willing to look at messy data, and I'm glad you're willing to look at the data in a descriptive way, not just, and try to explore hypotheses and are modest about your conclusions. We need a lot more work in this area. I've often said that I wish we could somehow get 20 or 30 PhD dissertations on infrastructure costs. That would be great. And maybe your paper will inspire some other work. Having said that you're appropriately modest in your conclusions, I want to push you a little bit on that. There is either benign or malign interpretations of a lot of the stuff you're doing. So, so housing cost and rising income, environmental concerns are correlated with higher highway cost. Okay, so the benign interpretation is these higher costs are just due to, we're appropriately increasing the quality broadly defined of highways in the sense of being more environmentally sensitive, being more sensitive to neighborhoods, doing lots of things. This is all good. We should be very happy about our rising infrastructure cost and just recognize it's the price of a civilized society. The malign interpretation is this is just a proxy for NIMBYism gone wild. And that what's going on is just terrible, and it's just due to the fact our society, we can no longer make decisions. Everything gets endlessly litigated in courts. Everything gets tied up in endless reviews, and we're a society that can no longer make decisions. So, what would you bet on?
Can I add something to that? And then Tracy Swear will get you in. What was fascinating to me, and I think this piggybacks, which is why I'm asking, that 90-10% ratio, right? So if you think about the fact that the people making the decision about how expensive this is going to be are only paying for 10% of the cost, right? So is this NIMBYism, or is it just the fact that if you give people incentives where they can spend a ton of money on something and they're not really paying for it, they'll do it? Can you fit that in with that too?
Well, I'll start with Kim and then I'll get to you. So I think one explanation for which we don't have a great test is at the beginning of the program, states try to be, let's not be judgmental, but call them responsible citizens, where they try to be fiscally prudent with federal dollars to show that they're sort of responsible stewards and that they could get more money to, build the interstate. But, as the program keeps going on, it's you've built 60% of the interstate system. Are the feds really going to say, and now the remaining 40%, forget it? So, it could be this kind of hold-up problem where the states no longer have this need to behave fiscally responsibly, let's put it that way. I don't have a way to evaluate that hypothesis in the data. Maybe I could sleep and think deeply. Maybe I can be super clever, but I don't have an answer for that one. But let's say it seems plausible. To answer your question, here's how a colleague of mine described it, which probably strikes me as which I'm probably not going to write in the paper, but as the best way of explaining it. At the beginning of the system, we internalized almost no externalities that the freeways caused, right? You want to build this freeway through some poor minority neighborhood, rip these people from their homes, right, go ahead, build it, doesn't matter. And that probably wasn't the best outcome. Now it may be that in addition to internalizing all these public, you can either think it's public benefits or public costs, however you want to frame it, the negatives or positives of the freeway, we are also internalizing private benefits or costs into our decision. And it's those private benefits or costs, for which we could either pay compensation or which we should ignore, which we shouldn't be internalizing. So if you were to ask me before, we were internalizing too few externalities, now we are internalizing too many, and that there's probably some happy medium to which we have not yet reached, but I don't think that's going to go in the paper, partially because I don't have any particular evidence to speak to that.
Hi, Tracy Gordon, Tax Policy Center, and I've dabbled in this area and just want to second Tim's comments on how I'm so glad you're doing more than dabbling. Also, to Tim's point, I think that NBER actually has been pushing more transportation research, which I see as a very welcome sign. I was sort of wondering a couple years ago, where are all the great dissertations similar to you? I was going to propose a different kind of time-varying explanation for the sort of state-federal relationship, and this is sort of what Tony Downs calls Downs' law, but it's just induced demand, that basically you build another lane mile and then more people come onto the road, right? So you have this sort of never-ending problem of people being frustrated that they're stuck in traffic, putting pressure on their government to spend more, adding an extra lane, and then guess what? There's more traffic. This is all in the absence of pricing, I should say, as a good economist. So I wonder if there's sort of a last miles being the hardest and therefore changing the incentive to try to, I wonder if it's possible to try to get stuff into the national highway system, or if there's sort of, I know that there are sort of issues there in terms of tolling and sort of incentives for states to have either claim stuff or not claim stuff as federal. But I would think, especially when you've got that political dynamic going on, that could be important. Also, there's this paper called Freeway Revolts with an exclamation point at the end, right, which is exactly what you were just talking about, that there are disamenities and amenities, and both of those things could make it really expensive, that you've got the communities that are being hurt protesting, you've got the communities that have high income and high wants and gold-plated freeways that are also showing up. So I was also going to say, as someone who's dabbled in this, I want to believe the decentralization hypothesis and the number of local governments might not be the best measure of that. So if you have many local governments that need to sign off on a project in addition to the federal government, that's going to make the process more lengthy and more costly. What I would do, rather than looking at the number of local governments, is it possible to create some kind of like Herfindahl measure of the amount of spending that happens at each level, right? So if there is like one powerful local government that's doing all the work and a bunch of sort of paper tigers, that doesn't matter as much as like many governments that want to have a seat at the table or whose constituents want to have a seat at the table.
Okay, let me go backwards and try to be brief. So I also thought the number of local governments was going to be super important. I think your idea is a great one, and I will try it. And second, I think we might be missing some governments. So the census of governments collects a certain set of governments, but from personal experience of my friend who works for the city of San Diego, there's a lot of overlapping federal jurisdictions sometimes that increase costs, and you can't measure that in the sense of governments. So I'm just afraid that I'm missing some governments, and I don't know how to measure that. And in a brief and incomplete answer to the first point, we do see that controlling for the number of lane miles basically doesn't have any impact on the spending per mile over time. And a shout out to Tracy, who wrote a blog post with David Schleicher a couple of years ago that inspired a lot of what we've done.
All right, so we are officially out of time. I thank all of the participants, both the presenters and the discussants, for doing sort of a great job going forward. I think this all leads into what the plenary is going to be now. I just spent a lot of time reading these papers thinking, well, are any of these things going to help these struggling communities that we're about to talk about? And if not, are there things that we can do? So I encourage you all to talk to the authors, talk to the discussants, have some discussion before we all go in for the closing plenary, which should be great. Thank you all.